At this point, I'd like to introduce Amer Zahr. He is a law professor at UDM. He is also a comic, and he is here to, I'll let him more fully introduce, but to discuss the connection between the Palestinian, the Palestinian liberation struggle and the Black liberation struggle. We've been looking forward to this for quite some time, so I do hope you enjoy it. And I will let Amer take it from here. Thank you, Amer.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sean. Thanks all for having me here today. I want to clarify that I am an adjunct professor at Detroit Mercy, so nobody accuses anybody of doing anything that is saying that they're more than they are. I'm an adjunct professor at Detroit Mercy. I teach on critical race theory and specifically on Arab Americans and how we became white under American law and what that means and the problems that it has caused us. So thank you all again for having me here tonight. I'm very happy to be here. I live in Dearborn, Michigan, which is the Arab American capital. I hope many of you have visited. Please do. It's like the Arab Disneyland. We have everything there. It's a great place, great food, great people. The only place you can get a falafel, a hookah, and a protest all in the same day. So I encourage people to come down and visit, and please, please, please spend some time in Dearborn. Well, you know, there might not have been a more opportune time to give this talk than tonight. As we are all following the news in Palestine, we see more war, death, and protest happening in my homeland. I'm originally Palestinian. All four of my grandparents are refugees, as well as my two parents, who were all ethnically cleansed from their homeland by the state of Israel. And we're using that term without reservation, kicked out of their homeland because they were the wrong race or religion, and more importantly, not allowed to go back. And this has been going on for us since 1948. And it is why is it important to talk about that? It's important, look, as lawyers, and especially in law school, right? What do we learn? We learn that it's important to know all the facts about a situation. It's important to have the big picture in mind. And then after that, it's important to really zero in on what the fundamental issues are and how to address them and how to solve them. And so what we've been dealing with as Palestinians is a program of ethnic cleansing that has been documented not only by Palestinian historians, but by Israeli historians as well, since 1948. And what's been going on in the last couple weeks that started to make the news, and especially the last 3 or 4 days that has gotten more violent, is a continuation of that program. The last few weeks in Jerusalem, there have been court actions to evict, they're calling it eviction, evict Palestinians from a neighborhood in East Jerusalem and replace them with Israeli settlers, most of whom happen to be American. This is an American settler organization, without any compensation. And in fact, there was a court order ordering the Palestinian, they call them tenants there, to pay each settler $20,000 in legal fees for the hassle of having to go to court to evict them. This doesn't happen in a democratic society, right? We have a state where you simply have more rights if you're Jewish than if you're not. Simply have more rights if you're Jewish than if you're not, starting with, of course, the law of return to Palestine and the land of Israel, which says if you're Jewish anywhere in the world, you can return immediately and get citizenship. And if you were born there, like all four of my grandparents and my two parents, and you're Palestinian and you've left or become a refugee, that you don't share that same right. So this is the world that Palestinians deal with. And frankly, there has been a long tradition of solidarity between not only African Americans, but also African movements for justice and liberation and the Palestinian movement. Nelson Mandela in 1997 said that we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Desmond Tutu, Nobel Peace Prize winner and South African activist and priest, said often, and he said it very clearly in 2014, that the Israeli government is practicing the same kind of apartheid, and he said sometimes even worse, in Palestine than what was happening under the apartheid system in South Africa. We've had a long line of African-American intellectuals and leaders speak about the issue in Palestine over the last few years, especially. Among them are Cornel West, Mark Lamont Hill, Reverend William Barber, Michelle Alexander, who's a law professor, or lawyer and a law professor, as we all know, who wrote about Jim Crow, and Angela Davis. So these links are not foreign to us. And in fact, in the past few years, Palestinians have been very loud about our support for the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, in 2014, when we all saw those pictures of Ferguson, where you had the cops in military gear approaching Black protesters in Ferguson and using tear gas, one of the first things that happened was that tweets started flowing in from activists in Palestine advising their Black brothers and sisters in Ferguson on how to deal with the tear gas, because we have a long experience dealing with tear gas. Some of the advice was like, one of them was get close to the cops, because if you're too close, they can't tear gas you, because then they tear gas themselves. So this sort of allegiance and solidarity is actually very long-standing. At the same time, we Palestinians deal with barrages of misinformation. And as an activist and as a comedian when I'm on stage, and sorry that it's not too comedic tonight, as buildings, full buildings, residential buildings in Gaza are being bombed by the Israeli military and taken down, is that we have to focus in on what's the fundamental issue. Yes, there are skirmishes, and yes, there are Palestinians that misbehave, and words get thrown around like terrorism, and terrorism happens on both sides, depending on how you define that term. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with an occupier and an occupied, an oppressor and an oppressed. There are 5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, whose entire freedom of mobility is determined by whether or not the Israelis let them out of those lands. 5 million of them whose daily lives are fully controlled by Israel, whose trade policies, the only goods that are allowed to come into the West Bank and Gaza are only allowed to come in based on whether or not the Israelis allow them in. And in fact, in many times, they don't allow certain goods in so that they can be the only supplier of goods. 5 million of those Palestinians who live in West Bank and Gaza are citizens of nowhere, stateless, the last stateless people on planet Earth, fully stateless, and do not vote for the government that determines their daily life. Yes, there is a Palestinian Authority, which is basically a student council, which doesn't have any real power. I mean, if you were all on student council in high school, you might remember it might have been cool to call yourself the president or the treasurer or the secretary, but you didn't decide when school started and when it ended, and you didn't decide what day the football games were, and you didn't decide a lot of important things. Same thing is true about the Palestinian Authority, of where there is corruption, but let's understand what their actual power is. They do not have autonomy. And so you have 5 million Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza who are not allowed to vote. You have about 2 million more Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. However, we've seen, and there are human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, which is one of the most respected human rights organizations in the world, which have recently announced that Israel is operating in an apartheid fashion. Those 2 million Palestinians who live inside of Israel and have Israeli citizenship, while they enjoy many formal rights like voting and they can be members of parliament and these kinds of things, just like Black people were members. There was a Black senator in 1865. There was a Black Supreme Court justice in the 50s. It didn't mean everything was okay. All right, just because these things exist, we still see, and there have been Human Rights Watch, and in fact, many Israeli human rights organizations have also shown that, for instance, in the educational system, the public educational system, because you have schools that are public, Israeli public schools that are in heavily Arab areas and Israeli public schools that are in heavily Jewish areas, that the schools in the Jewish area get $3 per student compared to $1 per student in the Arab areas. So triple the amount per student from government funding in Jewish schools than for Arab schools. This is apartheid. You literally have in the West Bank, see, I sometimes tell people, you don't have to read about Jim Crow and apartheid in history books. I urge you to take a flight and go to Palestine. It's the living museum of these things. In the West Bank, there is literally separate roads for Jews and Palestinians. Literally, it's not, I'm not, you know how sometimes people say literally, sometimes a teenager might say, I was literally gonna die, and you're like, no, you weren't. But this is literally separate roads for Jews and Palestinians in the West Bank, separate IDs and separate status. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers who live in the West Bank, which is not recognized as part of Israel, have full voting rights and act fully as citizens of Israel, healthcare, voting rights, so on and so forth, where, of course, the 5 million Palestinians who live there do not. You have another about 400,000 Palestinians that live in Jerusalem, which Israel annexed illegally, who have, again, some formal rights, but are disallowed to vote in national elections simply because they're Palestinian. They are not allowed to vote for who the prime minister is. They can vote in local elections, like the mayor, but they cannot vote in national elections. What do you call that? You call that Jim Crow. You call that apartheid. We have a name for these things. And these names are ugly. They're not cute. It's not nice to talk about these things. But ethnic cleansing, Jim Crow, and apartheid is what we're talking about. And there have been a number of Black intellectuals who have made that connection and talked about it openly. Like I said before, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Mark Lamont Hill, Reverend William Barber, Cornel West, Angela Davis, and Michelle Alexander, and have paid prices for it. If any of you follow Professor Mark Lamont Hill, you might remember that a couple years ago, he made a speech at the UN in which he talked about Palestinian liberation and freedom. And he said Palestinians should be free in all of their land from the river to the sea. And the next day, CNN fired him. The next day, CNN fired him. Where Jeffrey Toobin, who you might, a fellow lawyer friend of ours, got caught doing something untoward on camera, as you might remember. It took them 3 weeks and many meetings to decide whether or not to fire him. Okay, so this is what we deal with. Finally, I'll talk about the silencing of our voices, which has been going on way too long. And I thank organizations like the NLG and the leaders here for opening that up and opening up this kind of discourse, whereas years ago would not have been allowed. But still, there's a major silencing of our voices. In fact, in the last week, Facebook and Instagram were found to have deleted posts that had certain hashtags in support of Palestinian rights. And we know that they did it because 2 days ago, they came out and apologized about it. They called it a technical glitch or something like this. Imagine if every Black Lives Matter hashtag was deleted for 2 or 3 days. Imagine the arguments that sometimes come out of Zionism, which say, well, there's 23 Arab countries. Why don't you go live there? Imagine if some movement for liberation or national movement came and decided that, you know what, Kenya is going to be where we're going to do our country. And we're going to kick people out because this has to be a country of our people. And they said to the Kenyans, you know what, there's a lot of African countries. Just go live there. The Kenyans might say, no, this is our home. This is where we want to live. And finally, let me say this. I'll say what one of our great intellectuals, Edward Said, said. There is, of course, sometimes we run into the argument that we're denying someone else's connection to the land of Palestine. Of course not. Palestine has been a land that, because of the religious significance, has had a number of civilizations come through it over the years, right? Jewish, Arab, Greek, Byzantine, Roman, Turks, Mongols, Crusaders, even for a couple hundred years, okay? Now, Arab presence has been there clearly for 1,400 years, but many of these different people have come through ethnically and culturally and racially. So, of course, there is a Jewish connection to Palestine and a Jewish claim to Palestine. Of course there is. But that's not what Zionism says. Zionism says this is the only claim, and the claim that trumps all other claims and allows people to be ethnically cleansed in pursuit of that claim. This is what we Palestinians are grieving about and have been grieving about for 73 years. And this is the connection we make clearly to the struggle in South Africa, the struggle for Black civil rights here, and the connection that many Black intellectuals and activists have made as well. So with that, I want to thank you for having me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to have any discourse with anybody. I know that these issues are not easy, but it's something that as Palestinians, we need to tell our stories. So thank you again, and I'm happy to speak to anybody if they wish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I am going to turn it back over to our election committee chair, Sean. Actually, I'm not going to do that because I know he's probably busy trying.
Sean had an announcement he'd asked me to make.
Oh, go ahead, honey. Go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't mean to break in. Just as a point of information, Sean's going to be sending out a different link shortly. They're doing tech support right now, and that should be in everybody's inboxes soon.
Awesome. While we wait, let's hear from Doyle, who I'm so envious of, is having a nice glass of wine on camera.
Victoria, can I interrupt you real quick? I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
I did have a question for our great speaker, Brother Amer. I mean, is there anything that you can tell us now or you think will be most beneficial in how we can support the brothers and sisters and children and women and men and everyone who's putting their lives on the line, who are dying every day? What can we do besides just hashtagging? Is there anything that you recommend that you think that we can really engage in this fight together?
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. What I would say is, again, to be our messengers. Look, we know that civil rights and human rights struggles don't succeed when it's only the victims talking. We should be leading the way, but we need solidarity from other people, because there are people who simply, and unfortunately this is true, and we see this with the Black Civil Rights Movement and Black Lives Matter. I was a student of the Black Lives Matter movement from 2014 till now, and I saw something very similar between us and that movement, which is there's a lot of emotions you see that come out. Anger, sadness, rage, frustration, but never shock. I've never met one Black person in America shocked at the actions of police towards, because it's been going on since the beginning of time. And so we feel the same way yet, and we've been talking about it. So my point is here, Black people were saying, we've been talking about this, right? Why didn't anybody listen? And then when unfortunately that's the way it is, no one listens to the victims. They need that solidarity for other people to speak up. So the truth is, the best way you can help us is to speak to your own circles, to talk about this issue, and to keep it simple and concise. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing. This is what's been going on. It's as simple as that. There's all kinds of other things that become distractions, but I need all of you to become messengers of this message to your own communities, because they won't listen to me, and they haven't been listening to me or other Palestinians. This is the syndrome of a victim. So we do need you to actually, I mean, you call it hashtag in life, you know, talk to people in your life. And remember, to always frame Palestine is not a humanitarian issue. Palestine is a political crisis with humanitarian implications. So the blockade on Gaza since 2005 is a political problem. They're blockaded because they're Palestinian. It has terrible humanitarian consequences. But this is, I wish it was simply a humanitarian issue, because those are solved with money. This is a political issue which needs to be solved with will and people speaking up for justice. And I'll tell you right now, some of you will, and you will get terrible pushback. And you might have already. And there might even be terrible pushback from this event tonight. But that's the price sometimes of speaking justice. Sometimes you're alone, especially in the beginning, and that's just the way it is. And sometimes that means you're doing the right thing. So to answer your question, please, yes, just speak up in your own circles, because each of you has a circle of people that I'll never reach that will listen to what you have to say.
Absolutely.
Oh, let me also say, sorry, very quickly, if anyone is interested, on Sunday at 1 p.m. in Dearborn, in front of the police station, we are having a rally for Palestinian rights. Sunday, 1 p.m. in Dearborn in front of the police station. If anyone would like to attend, then you can get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to give you more information about that. Also a good opportunity to get great food right after the demonstration. I mean, we have great food in Dearborn. I don't know if anybody knows, but come down and get the food, man. Even if you are only coming for the food and the demonstration is secondary, I'm okay with that too. Just come on down. You can actually do lunch, demonstration, hookah. I wasn't joking. Lunch, demonstration, hookah, and that fills up your whole Sunday. It'd be a wonderful, wonderful day. So I invite everybody down. I also want to give a shout out to Yasmin Haidar, who is here, who's one of my former students and a new member of the National Lawyers Guild. You can reach out to her or Sean to get in touch with me. I would put my phone number in the chat. I'll put my phone number in the chat if people want to get it too. But, you know, I just want you to know, since I've come on the chat, we've also gotten probably uninvited guests from the CIA and the FBI that are also watching. So everyone smile for them. If everyone wants to smile for the CIA and the FBI that are definitely watching, if they weren't before. But thank you again, Victoria.
Yeah, they're always with us.
Yeah, they're always with us. And I just want to say, Victoria, while I'm here with you, I was proud to support you and vote for you in the last election. You stood up for values that were important to all of us as human beings.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.